PhDs. How many do you have? She has 2 PhDs, one from Harvard and the other from the Institute of Clinical Social Work in Chicago. She has 2 master's degrees, one from Harvard and one from Holy Names, and a BA in music from Boston University. She's an ordained Episcopal priest, as well as a licensed psychotherapist. Now, let me just pause right here for just a minute. Is anybody else feeling very lazy tonight about what you've done with your life? I am too. I join you in that. I want to let you know that I first came to be aware of Dr. Cooper White from a connection with her husband, Michael Cooper White, who is the interim president of Bright Divinity School. And Michael is here this evening too, right here in the front. So thank you so much for being here. She is an award-winning author. She is the author of 10 books, over 100 articles, and her most recent book is entitled The Psychology of Christian Nationalism. And she is here tonight to talk to us.
Thank you so much. Well, good evening. Wow, it's hard for me to see you all in one sweep. It's great. What a wonderful turnout. So, as I have on my slide here, some of the images in this PowerPoint may be disturbing to some audience members. I actually hope a few of them are. And Confederate flag, extremist political images, but that is my trigger warning for tonight. And so let us begin. Uh-oh. Oh, it happened. Okay. So this, by now, images like this should be familiar to you. On January 6, 2021, as we all know all too well by now, a violent mob attacked the U.S. Capitol in a shocking effort to stop the certification of the election of Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. Deep in the midst of the mob was a loose-knit band of religiously motivated individuals who subscribed to the movement called Christian nationalism. On display among the crowds during the attack on the Capitol were numerous signs and flags with "Jesus Saves" in bold letters and other Christian symbols proudly displayed alongside a Confederate flag paraded through the halls of Congress. A photo that went viral showed a group of men before a, 8 or 9 foot cross, one with his forehead pressed against it in apparent fervent prayer. One group among the mob called themselves a Jericho March, Christians blowing shofars, praying to bring down the walls of government. Now, those of us who were not caught up in the violence on January 6th, nor the underlying beliefs that fueled it, still wonder, how can people, even those we consider to be good people, get so caught up in a web of lies? How can Christians who believe in Jesus' Abba, God of love, mercy, justice, and truth, participate in such a movement fueled by white supremacy, masculinism, and even far-fetched conspiracy theories, while ignoring or even condoning its propensity toward violence? How can people be convinced of such false, even delusional beliefs? How might it be possible to talk with people who have gone down the rabbit hole of brainwashing and irrational groupthink? And how many of you, just show of hands, know someone, family member, a fellow congregant, a neighbor who you believe has gone down the rabbit hole of irrational beliefs? Whoa. All right. So, can dialogue help draw them back out? And if so, how? Is it ever possible to talk sense into someone who's come to believe dangerous untruths that, if not addressed, can harm us all? When, how, and in what context might dialogue be fruitful? And when does it simply raise the other person's defenses, closely guarded defenses, and reinforce polarization? Former President Trump and his close imitators appeal goes far beyond certain conservative policies against abortion, immigration, welfare, gender justice, and racial equity. Trump tapped into a deep and broad reservoir of resentment and paranoia that has been accumulating for decades. A large pool of Christians who feel they are being persecuted and are called by God to rise up and defend themselves against their enemies and gods. And not only must they regain equal footing with others in society, many believe, but they must dominate and be in control, and all this in the name of Jesus. A common belief among supporters of Christian nationalism is that there has been a woeful decline of America's standing in the world because of the nation's growing degeneracy, and with it the concomitant belief in an urgent call to restore the nation to its original goodness and a mandate to lead the world in godliness. The United States was founded, according to this group, by evangelical Christians, all of them, evangelical Christians, based on a misreading of the more complex history of the framers of the Constitution, and just consider Jefferson as one example, and had God's special mandate to become a new Jerusalem in which white male Christians will rule over a nation whose laws are perfectly aligned with their own selective fundamentalist reading of biblical mandates. Theologically, an extreme version of Calvinism called dominionism and a radical subset of that called Reconstructionism trickled down into evangelical Protestantism without most churchgoers even realizing the origins of this shift to a postmillennial apocalyptic message. A similar movement called integralism has been gaining traction in the Catholic Church, meaning to integrate the state under the ultimate spiritual authority of God, of course, as interpreted by the Church. In my observations, in my research, Christian nationalist preachers tend to leap across the whole Bible from what they call the Old Testament to the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, making scant reference, if at all, to the teachings of Jesus about love, healing, and justice. They jump from a highly selective reading of the Hebrew Bible that they believe supports the idea of a wrathful God directly to the second coming of Jesus in the end of days. In their interpretation of apocalyptic scripture, many see an avenging Jesus coming to wage spiritual warfare against the current decadent ways of America and the world. Those who hold such views perceive a growing depravity of the current age as evidence that the end of times is near, and it's their duty to help bring it about. Christian nationalist preachers exhort the faithful in sermons and song to take this nation back, even by force if required. I believe we are at a pivotal moment in the American experiment of democracy and also in the very character of American Christianity. The term Christian nationalism, according to my research, really means white nationalism. The main tenets of Christian nationalism are that God established the United States as a Christian nation and therefore should essentially be a theonomy shaped by ultra-conservative Christian values and a theocracy characterized by the headship of men over their households and mostly white male leadership in the public sphere. Christian nationalism, therefore, stands in opposition to the separation of church and state, rather advocating for the display of Christian symbols in public spaces and explicitly Christian prayer in schools and civic gatherings. Now, I want to make a really important distinction here, which is that many black church Protestants also align Christian values with politics, but they align them to gospel-grounded social and political action for change, whereas white Christian nationalist agenda is almost entirely opposed to what we would consider social justice and stands opposed to virtually everything taught in Christianity or Judaism about compassion and justice. Christian nationalist adherents oppose religious pluralism. They oppose just immigration policies to keep out Muslims, migrants who are, quote, poisoning the blood of our country, and communist vermin, as Trump just said this past week, frankly echoing the dehumanizing nationalist blood and soil and fascist anti-Semitic tropes. They oppose abortion without exception, even in cases of rape or incest. They oppose expanding the rights of women, LGBTQ persons, with a recent rise in attacks on trans persons. And in a long chain of history, beginning with the utterly denied genocidal founding of this nation, they oppose civil rights legislation and embrace laws that perpetuate structural and institutional racism. We've seen a lot of examples of that in terms of voter suppression. Both anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim attacks have been on the rise ever since Trump's first presidential campaign, while extremists chant the Nazi slogan, "Jews will not replace us." Some dominionists also believe that eco-justice and addressing climate change is moot because the apocalypse is coming and this earth will be destroyed anyway. Yeah, really. Let me be clear then. Christian nationalism is a fanatical, radical departure from the teachings of Jesus and any faithful reading of either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, and it is also dangerously anti-democratic. Now, Christians, both mainline or liberal and evangelical, have begun to sound the alarm from within the church about the dangers of Christian nationalism and its corrosive effects on both the nation and on American Christianity itself. Most notably now, an organization founded by the Baptist Central Committee called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. This organization has a ton of wonderful resources, educational materials, and they're actually starting a pilot program of ecumenical dialogue and education here in North Texas. So they're doing wonderful work, and I encourage you to look them up. And of course, as Pastor Russ just said, the disciples have really led the way with their pronouncement at their last General Assembly. So not all Christians agree with Christian nationalism. It's important to say that because it seems like there are so many voices that support it. Lest we conclude that Christian nationalism is a fringe movement, however, involving only a small percentage of Christians, some recent statistics show that as many as 2/3 of all American Christians taken together, this is according to the latest Baylor Religion Survey, agree with at least some elements of Christian nationalism. The most recent set of survey questions posed by the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, and the Brookings Institute indicate that close to 1/3 of Americans, so that would be the red and the orange that you see as the slices of the pie there, adherents agree wholly, 10%, and sympathizers, those who are in sympathy, another 19%, with another 39% of skeptics who do not entirely reject Christian nationalism, but are perhaps more persuadable to reject it. Survey respondents were asked to what degree they agreed with the following statements. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation, not just be one, officially declare it. The U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American, and God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Christian nationalism incorporates something called a seven-mountain mandate, popularized by Campus Crusade and Youth with a Mission, which claims Christians should have dominion over 7 areas of life: home, religion, schools, business, media, entertainment, and government. That kind of covers it all, doesn't it? 85% of Christian nationalist adherents agree that discrimination against white Americans has become as big a problem as discrimination against Black Americans and other minorities. And 81% of adherents agreed with a statement that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background, meaning white European. In another recent study, 60% of adherents and 37% of sympathizers agree that non-Christians create immoral policies. I find that one particularly shocking. Christian nationalist adherents, just to give you an idea of the geography of this, are concentrated primarily in the South and in rural areas, sorry, Texas, with pockets in the West and the upper Midwest, where sympathizers also tend to live in rural areas and also towns. Like many nationalist movements around the world, rural areas tend to have the highest concentration. Over 3/4 of all adherents and sympathizers taken together are white evangelical Protestants. So among Christian nationalists, over 3/4 are I always get these backwards. They are white evangelical Protestants. And then if you flip it, within evangelical Protestantism, 80 to 84% agree. Of course, this also means that around 20%, 1 in 5, do not agree. So there's hope. Catholics also make up a significant percent, about 1 in 5. Lower formal education tends to correlate with the degree of agreement with Christian nationalist beliefs, and on average, supporters of Christian nationalism are older than the general population, averaging in the mid-50s. Women represent just slightly more than half of those who agree, and 94%, according to one study, quote, overwhelmingly believe in God without any doubts at all and hold the Bible in high esteem, which is twice the number of skeptics and 7 times more than rejectors. A vast publishing empire and online Christian family content, such as James Dobson's decades-old Focus on the Family, also promotes Christian nationalist ideas as part of its campaign to promote the traditional patriarchal family and to indoctrinate children into a melding of religion, right-wing patriotism, and a conservative, God-honoring definition of Christian family life. And you may remember he came under some fire some years ago for endorsing corporal punishment. Right-wing Christian church services are awash in patriotic symbol and song, and public political rallies are now awash in evangelical prayer and so-called Christian praise music. So if you didn't know which each of these 3 events were which, it would be hard to tell the difference. You may remember Michael Flynn, who was pardoned by Trump for lying to the FBI, which is a federal crime, is now leading a national reawakening tour to recruit an army of God, blending alt-right politics, Christian rhetoric, and QAnon conspiracy theory. And it's somewhere between $250 and $500 a ticket. You can even get in and get baptized in a big metal tub. Now, this movement did not just arrive on the scene around the time of Trump's first presidential campaign. We tend to associate it with Trump, but it goes back quite a bit further. The current wave goes back at least as far as the Reagan era in the 1980s and such figures as Pat Robertson. It was part of a general white conservative backlash to the civil rights movement in the 1960s and a continuation of the white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and a nostalgia for the lost cause of the Confederacy that all converged in Jim Crow and the KKK. But it's also prefigured and has continued to wax and wane over time as part of a larger recurrence of revivalist movements led by charismatic white evangelicals all throughout American history. Confederates were not the first to use biblical texts to justify the genocide of Native Americans, chattel slavery, and the subordination of women under the guise of protecting the weaker sex and preventing them from voting. Christian nationalism in the form of dominionism, further, has not been confined to religious settings, but leaders of the movement have long been planning how to implement this Seven Mountain Mandate, and historians such as Robert Jones have documented the many covert coalitions with other right-wing political operatives over many decades. A scholar of Reconstructionism, Julie Ingersoll, has stated, "The niceties of democracy fall by the wayside when you're on God's side fighting Satan." And this movement is very strategic, and it's in it for the long haul. Christian-identified law schools' curricula are explicitly designed to send out an ever-increasing cadre of graduates to strengthen the influence of conservative Christian beliefs on the practice of law, the judiciary, and government. A covert Christian right legislative campaign called Project Blitz, sponsored by the Congressional Prayer Caucus and other right-wing Christian groups, has pushed its model bills through state legislatures and has an annual playbook for dominionist legislative strategy. You may wonder why so many states some of the same bills, almost word for word, seem to keep cropping up in different states. This is why. And a legal defense fund called the Alliance Defending Freedom, or ADF, has increasingly been successfully targeting reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights in court cases across the U.S., using the First Amendment to justify the right to discriminate. A recent New York Times article further exposed how wealthy alt-right activists like the Wrights, the owners of Hobby Lobby, and Christian nationalist pastors came together and strategically gained access and influence with Justice Alito and his Supreme Court staff. And we're now seeing the fruits of this strategic infiltration at every level of government, from local school boards, where the fights are really hot right now, to state legislatures, to the decades-long campaign to pack the Supreme Court with anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ justices, and as we have just seen, also anti-affirmative action. Most recently, very recently, Republicans elected Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House, which he is a self-avowed promoter of Christian nationalist tenets, which he hopes to push forward in Congress. Just last week, just outside his office door, he placed a Revolutionary-era flag, Appeal to Heaven, which has been adopted by the Christian nationalist movement and a far-right group called the New Apostolic Reformation, to which he has ties. Now, this flag is meant to mean that Americans should seek protection from the Almighty rather than the government, and the nation's government should be ruled by God's law. So take a breath. How do we understand the appeal of this movement, which now has purchase not only in religious but civic and private domestic life? In my research, I have focused on the psychology of the movement, namely, why and how do people get hooked on Christian nationalism and related conspiracy theories? And I utilize both sociological and psychoanalytic lenses to explore the psychology behind people's vulnerability to being captivated by false teachings, both religious and political, and their personal investment in maintaining those beliefs. First, from a more sociological perspective, I would propose at least 4 conscious motivations behind adherence to Christian nationalist ideas. The first is belonging. Evangelization fulfills the need for belonging and a sense of life purpose. And of course, you know, many of you are members of congregations, and you know the good side of that, right? That you can be part of a community that cares about the community and does so because of a belief in Jesus' mandate to care for the poor and the outcast. So I'm not saying all evangelization is bad, but evangelization from a high-octane conservative Christian movement not only fulfills this sense of community and a longing for a sense of life purpose, it's heightened by the religious rhetoric and appeal to join in a cosmic battle of good versus evil, with tactics that are similar and at times nearly identical with cult recruiting. And I don't have time tonight to go into the details of that, but there are some specifics about that in my book. A second fear is the loss of white social status. Resentment against a perceived, though still quite minimal statistically, loss of jobs and economic power to immigrants and people of color, and a desire to maintain or regain white supremacy and white power, in the face of the reality that, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the year 2042 will mark the end of a white majority population in the United States. Now, many of us might find that an exciting prospect for more diversity and enrichment of our lives together multiculturally, but for those folks who have seen being white as kind of the only grasp they have on having dignity, I may be poor, I may be this or that, but at least I'm not black. And so they find this to be an existential threat. The Republican Party has become the disproportionate home perceived as a protective buttress for white Christians who make up over 2/3 of the party, 68%, while the nation as a whole is just currently 42% white and Christian. And according to a recent study by Michael Podhorzer, when House of Representatives districts are ranked by the percentage of voters who are white evangelicals, so districts where white evangelicals have the highest majority, the top 2 quintiles are represented overwhelmingly by Republicans. So it has become a party of the white resentful. Another reason is another fear of loss of patriarchal authority and a masculinist hierarchy both in the home and in the public sphere of work and governmental power, which is also related to an infatuation with guns that far exceed any need for hunting or personal protection. And I'm going to say more about guns in a moment. And finally, all of these fears can slide into paranoia, the irrational allure of conspiracy theories such as QAnon, whose beliefs are now adopted by as many as 1 in 5 Americans overall and 1/4 of evangelical Christians, exemplifying what historian Richard Hofstadter identified as a long-standing paranoid style in American politics. If you look at this image, you see the QAnon flag, and right below it, God wins, heart, heart. Where we go one, we go all. That's the QAnon motto. So it's a blending of religious rhetoric and QAnon. Now, these 4 motivations that I've just outlined for you, they're made explicit by individuals to varying degrees, but they're conscious to the degree that supporters of Christian nationalism would agree to them even if using different language to describe them. Turning toward unconscious motivations, these involve the insidious subliminal pulls from unconscious group dynamics, going back to Sigmund Freud's prescient analysis of groups in 1921, and parallels between Christian nationalism and the power of cult-like groups and their narcissistic leaders to make and amplify false claims, including the role of both mainstream and social media. Now, the power of group persuasion was long known by psychologists throughout history, and it's not unique to right-wing conservatives. Anyone, even with the highest personal ideals, can become swept up in a movement that becomes extremist, on the left as well as the right, and within many different religious groups that may splinter off to become cults. I believe Freud's group psychology is as relevant a description today as it was in his own time regarding the psychologically symbiotic bond between followers and their idealized leaders. Freud's breakthrough on the heels of World War I was to recognize the power of the narcissistic leader and the ways in which followers unconsciously hand over their individual consciences to a demagogue who, with simplistic moral directives and all good versus all evil political rhetoric, promises to restore whatever they perceive is lacking in their lives. Such leaders exude a fusion of power and erotic potency that men can merge with at an unconscious level, and women can desire and even emulate themselves. So how relevant is this to the rise of right-wing strongman leaders like Trump and the bloody dictators across the globe that he still emulates and praises? So this also is where this ties in with the symbolic value of guns and a defensive hypermasculinity and the extraordinary prevalence of guns in the United States. A preoccupation that is shared by a majority of white evangelical Christians who own the most guns of any religious group in the US, nearly half, according to Pew, and who fuse the Second Amendment right to bear arms with a skewed religious fervor for personal freedom. As the Outback restaurant motto has it, no rules, just rights. Love, said Freud, puts a check on narcissism, and as such is crucial to civilization. But the narcissistic leader loves only himself and exploits the love and devotion of his followers only and always for his own benefit, as he sees it, according to his whims. A high-conformity group with a highly manipulative leader can exploit individuals who feel wounded, whether by repressed childhood traumas, or by envy, economic fears, and group resentments, or by a changing societal landscape that threatens one's cherished notions of tradition and even identity. Narcissistic leaders thrive on amplifying perceived threats and providing simplistic solutions. Appeals to nostalgia for a better, earlier time, usually fictional or benefiting only one ethnic group, can be wrapped in nationalism as patriotism rather than pure ethnocentrism, making a strong appeal to a glorious past that never was so glorious for scores of women, persons of color, and Native Americans. And the narcissistic leader can heighten this appeal by framing it all in terms of a religious cause. Such religious appeals invoke a battle of good versus evil in which fear is easily mobilized into hate. I need another sip of water. So taking all of this into consideration, how can we talk across the extreme political and religious divide that has emerged from these trends in white, right-wing Christian nationalism? Is it even possible to talk? If so, how? And if not, what to do instead? The purpose of this part of my book, as in the subtitle, is by no means to create a false peace forged by mainstream appeals to unity, which can gloss over the deadly realities of racism and other forms of oppression and silence movements for social justice and change. So I'm not advocating, as the Hebrew prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel both warned, crying peace, peace where there is no peace. Is honest, open conversation even possible? Now, several psychologists who've studied this phenomenon have stated no. Once people have gone down the rabbit hole of misinformation and conspiracy theories, there can be no convincing them of the truth. I disagree. As a therapist, I believe in talk, but under the right conditions. Rather than throwing in the towel, I recommend a triage approach to discern if and when fruitful conversation might be possible and when it should not be attempted. When it comes to a firmly entrenched adherent to Christian nationalist beliefs, we have to remember that we're trying to engage not only with an individual, but with their favorite news network, an ever self-reinforcing bubble of opinion fed to them on social media through algorithms sifting through their clicks and likes, and hundreds or even thousands of members of their church, where they just praised Jesus and asked him to save the United States while listening to heart-thumping rock music and indoctrinating sermons. We're trying to talk to QAnon. So remember this. If you remember one thing from tonight, argumentation will not work. Period. Don't do it. We do need to walk away whenever we perceive that to continue in a one-sided dialogue will either violate our own sense of personal integrity, continuing to engage with outright hate speech, or step away if we are being subjected to verbal violence, threats, or worse. And when dialogue is not possible, engagement in public education and political advocacy for justice are the best ways to channel our own frustration and outrage, and to publicly witness as liberal and progressive Christians, to show that not all Christians endorse a Christian nationalist agenda, which tends to be more visible in the culture. Write op-eds, especially in local newspapers, because those are the ones everybody reads. Run for office. Advocate for legislative change. Hold prayer vigils and other public expressions of religious resistance to authoritarianism and injustice. And when fruitful conversation with an individual may be possible, how do we put a toe in the water? First, we have to ask ourselves, am I the right person to be having this conversation? Is this the right time? And is this the right place? Thanksgiving dinner table's probably a no to all three of those. Just saying. If the answer to these questions is maybe yes, then there may be a yellow light. Proceed with caution. When we sense some openness, as in the case of a soft Christian nationalist who's not wholly convinced by right-wing rhetoric, and where mutual liking and respect are perhaps already established. So, for example, with a coworker, a neighbor, a skeptical family member, or a friendly acquaintance. And the only way in to such a conversation is to show respect and to listen, not to pounce on an error in their thinking or immediately try to enlighten them or heal them. I mean, who would appreciate that? It's so condescending. But to try to understand with as much empathy as we can muster what it must be like to be this person and to inhabit their life with its various challenges and stresses. Empathy is not the same thing as sympathy. It's being able to step into the other's shoes, at least to some meaningful degree, and understand where they're coming from. But by no means does it have to mean agreement. A green light is always tentative when it appears that there is some real openness to re-examine convictions. But remember, it can always turn yellow or even red at a moment's notice. I've outlined many recommendations in my book on how to engage in such conversation from my experience as teaching pastoral care and as a psychotherapist. But there are many recommendations, but first and foremost is that building and maintaining relationship comes first. Finding common ground, including shared values, because I assume that many people have a whole body of shared values, even if we disagree on this topic. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has talked about how Republicans tend to lean toward duty and responsibility and authority, whereas Democrats tend to gravitate toward care and justice. And we all care about all of those things, but we tilt in different directions. And so can we find the places where we do have agreement as a place to start? And then a very practical way of expressing respect and kindness is to make I statements. Much of what I advocate is being non-directive and making an I statement so you claim your own truth. Well, you know, I've come to believe this, as opposed to, this is what is right. And following longtime anti-racist feminist activist Loretta Ross, who recently received a MacArthur Genius Award, assuming goodwill until proven otherwise, and when confronting, engaging in a process she calls calling in, rather than publicly and self-righteously calling out the person who has said or done something we find offensive. She reserves calling out for addressing larger systems, calling up the abuses of institutions and structures of power. Being willing to listen and speak about the whole truth of what is happening in America today is finally a form of combating psychological splitting and working toward a more nuanced, complex view of political or religious movements beyond catchy sound bites. Recognizing and resisting the very human unconscious temptation to split everything into a Manichaean cosmic battle of good and evil, which is what conspiracy theorists thrive on. This requires stamina. It takes courage to consciously weigh the good and bad of a relationship and to hang in there without expecting instant change, as in make a well-reasoned argument and stir. Finally, one thing honest dialogue also requires is to do our own inner work of healing the split between our own desired purity and the mostly disavowed evil within ourselves, to withdraw our worst projections that we've placed on another person, demonizing them, before we can enter into genuine dialogue. Now, this is tricky because Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and anti-LGBTQ hatred are truly reprehensible. That's not merely our fantasy or our neurotic projection. But can we hold the badness of a conversation partner's beliefs together with a belief in the potential for basic human goodness, as we are made in the image and likeness of God? Then we may not only have the chance to exercise the skill of empathic listening, we may also finally be heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to take some time tonight for questions and answers. Thank you. Questions and answers. And so we have a microphone down here in the front. If you would make your way down there, I figure that'd be a lot easier than somebody running around and doing that. So if you have a question, please make your way down here.
Maybe we could put both of those down. I don't need it.
Can I begin?
Yes.
Thank you very much for writing your book. I really am enjoying reading it. Some time ago, I remember a commentator by the name of Glenn Beck saying that to President Obama at the time, that I hope you fail. And he seemed at the time to have been a perfect example of a person who would fall within the definition of Christian nationalism. But recently, I thought I understood him say that he regretted taking that stance. And I was wondering what made him revert to this kind of apologetic stance. Do you know the answer to that?
I don't. I haven't been following Glenn Beck per se. I'm not sure, maybe others of you know, whether he has whether he cloaked his rhetoric during that time in Christian rhetoric or not. I don't remember him doing that. There are plenty of white nationalists out there who are not necessarily fusing it together with Christian, dominance in the country. So Christian nationalists are kind of a subset of radical alt-right extremists. There's other people who do not fuse it with religious fervor. So I don't really know, but if he had a conversion of heart, great. You'll have to tell me more. Have I stunned you into silence?
One of the things that concerns me right now, especially given what's going on in the Middle East, is the way that fundamentalists and evangelicals are talking about this is the end time. This is the apocalypse. And I'd like to hear your comments about that.
Oh boy, yeah. I almost thought of making an aside earlier to reference that because, of course, it's so present to us all right now. There is a group of Christian Zionists, is what they call themselves. And they have been staunch supporters of Israel for a really long time, for decades now, because in their belief system, the second coming can't happen unless Jesus is able to come to Israel, and specifically to Jerusalem. And so they take the side of Israel without exception. And so there's a good number of people within this Christian nationalist fold who also would consider themselves to be ardent Zionists. I saw in central Pennsylvania, where we live, Gettysburg, the borough of Gettysburg is very liberal, and then the surrounding rural countryside is very red. And I've passed flags now that are out there that show half of an Israeli flag and half of an American flag blended together, and that sort of thing. And so it stems from this same post-millennial apocalyptic thinking. The problem with it, one of my friends calls it anti-Semites for Israel, because the second half of the story is that once Jesus comes, the Israelis all have to convert to Christianity or they're going to go to hell. So it's very instrumental. They don't really care about Israelis. They care about these conditions for the apocalypse to be met. I want to apply the same principles that I've been talking about in the last section of this talk to the whole discussion about Israel and Palestine, because I am personally really torn apart by what's happening right now, because I have many friends who are Jewish who are just traumatized and reeling from this. And I also have many Protestant friends who are very pro-Palestinian, but also within the progressive movement, by which I mean people who are consistently doing activist work for social justice. There's been this tragic now divide between people who, of course, we must say that what's happening to civilians on both sides is reprehensible, but it's split between Jewish progressives and others who still think Israel deserves to exist, and pro-Palestinian progressives, and they're literally clashing. And this is happening a lot on college campuses. It's happening at my institution and other places. And it's really, really hard to sort out because of all the complexities that actually exist in the region. It is not a simple matter. And Gaza and the West Bank aren't the same either. So I think when we talk to people about these issues, wherever you personally stand right now on it, it's important, again, to try to listen to the other side and not just sort of hammer home your point of view, because this is something that taps a lot of us very personally, and we need to be very careful about how we present ourselves and how we enter into dialogue. Because what's happening right now is another polarization that we really don't need any more polarizations in this country. And as Christians, I think it's incumbent upon us to pray for peace, as there's some really good things that have been put out by the American Friends of the Episcopal Diocese in Jerusalem, praying for peace for all the victims on all sides of this conflict. So that's a good resource. Michael?
So I have a friend who's a biologist, and she reminds me all the time that human beings are pack animals waiting for a leader. That the primal parts of our brains are far more determinative of our behavior than the more recently developed frontal lobe. So she always warns, be careful all the time and do not pretend that the problem is over there, that all of us are susceptible.
Yes.
So how do we not neglect ourselves and our susceptibility as we concentrate on those, quote-unquote, others over there?
Right. Well, the us versus them problem is just endemic now. And I think just saying what you said and being aware of that human tendency to want to split off into this is my group and those are the others, that's something we have to consciously keep resisting all the time because it is a lure. And Freud saw it psychoanalytically, of course. I mean, he saw it in terms of unconscious pulls, but there's also a neurobiological substrate for all of that as well. One thing a distinction I do want to make is that there are, within the whole Christian nationalist movement, there is a smaller group of charismatic leaders who are kind of in a tiered system, reporting to higher ups who have a lot of power and have a lot of political connections. And many of them are pastors of churches, or they are political operatives who talk in very religious terms. But the vast majority of people in the Christian nationalist movement are followers, not the leaders. And I think we do have to also bear in mind that because we're all vulnerable, in fact, one of my sources, Margaret Singer, wrote a book about cults saying the not me myth. We are all vulnerable to cult recruitment. When you get the right combination of the right allure and the right love bombing and the right leader who just really says things that catch you where you're at emotionally, we're all susceptible. And so to have some compassion, I think, on the people who've frankly been exploited and drawn in by people who really don't care about them, but who care about their own power. And that may be, I don't mean we should be condescending to people who have been pulled into the movement, but I do think it can be a point of empathy to understand that these are not people who made this up on their own.
They say confession is good for the soul.
Come on down.
So I have a person in my life, not by choice, but by marriage. And we recently found out that he was a supporter of Donald Trump. Probably if I kind of pushed it a little bit harder, I would determine he was probably a Christian nationalist, minus the Christian part. But we kind of got around that conversation, and the thing that I found myself doing was, how can you be so stupid? And of course,
That's useful.
yeah, and of course I too have had some training in doing psychology, and I know the steps and I know the things to do.
Right.
In fact, once upon a time, during peer counseling, we used to have little cards and start with the I statements, and and all
Yeah,
that
there
kind
you
of
go.
stuff. Yeah,
I didn't
and,
make this stuff up.
I didn't have my card at the time, but it did not turn out terrible. But it just kind of died on that kitchen table kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I'd like to say to you all, go ahead and try it. It's tough. It really is difficult to do, but it can be done. I truly believe it can be done. Next time I see him, I'm thinking maybe I might give it another shot and do it the correct way. And, maybe if we all just gave it a shot and tried it one time, it might work. I don't know.
Well, if you're the right person and it's the right time and place, and you determine that first, and no alcohol has been consumed, yes, I think the first step is not to say what you think, but to say, look, you know, we had a conversation that didn't go so well, and I really do want to understand where you're coming from with this. And listen. One of my former doctoral students liked to say, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And listen more than you talk. And really try to, and you can't fake it. I mean, you have to be genuinely interested and curious. And one of the things we say about psychotherapy is it's to cultivate people's curiosity about themselves and to help them understand why do I tick the way I do? And so if I'm genuinely interested in how you tick, then maybe you might become interested in it too. So that's the genuine curiosity and interest in an empathic way is going to go a lot farther than saying, let's re-enter that debate, because that's going to just reinforce the divide. There are some times when you just have to simply say, you know, we really don't agree, and maybe we just need to agree to disagree. But I'm a great believer in planting seeds, and if you can cultivate a relationship, it sounds like you still have a relationship with this person, if you can cultivate a relationship with somebody apart from the political debate and not allowing the political debate to become the one defining factor of your relationship. I know a lot of people fell out with family members over COVID and vaccinations and all of that. Your relationship is bigger than that. And so I'm a great believer in planting seeds where if they know that I'm a person that respects them and that I'm really interested in their well-being, and I have these funky political ideas that they don't agree with, but I seem to be a reasonable person who doesn't have 2 horns and a tail, maybe that will sit with them a little bit and maybe they'll begin to entertain some different thoughts just because they respect me because I respect them. Does it work all the time? No. And, you know, we have family members, too, that we don't agree on politics. They've seen my Facebook posts. They know exactly what I think. They've seen Michael's op-eds in the newspaper. They know exactly what we think. We don't need to hammer them with it, but we love them. And so there's a way in which we're able to kind of coexist and just say, yeah, you know, in that area, we probably just don't want to talk about that right now. And that's okay, you know. But I think staying in a relationship witnesses to something that's bigger.
I kind of want to piggyback on that point that you made, because currently, I'm having lunch every so often with someone who's actually at the January 6th riots. And I call him a fascist, he calls me a communist, but we have something in common. We're swimmers. We both swim, and we continue to have lunch. And there are some things he agrees with. There's some things that we see in common. So, and it's ongoing. I'm not going to change him. He's not going to change me. But we still have a good dialogue going. What I found interesting about this is there's a well-funded campaign, and anytime you have a theme or a thesis, and then you follow it up with facts, that you could bring any facts into it, people tend to believe and follow it, especially if the leaders are very charismatic. I'm wondering, what's the counter defense to that? The counter defense is, to me, I see none. Limousine liberals, no values, no morals, versus someone with some construction, some values. I recently saw an interview, for instance, with Eric McTactus on his book, Letters to the American Church. And he talked about these events going on, similar to what Bonhoeffer was going through in Germany. And they cast him aside. There was no moral structure. The leaders of the church were looking the other way. And then we had the Holocaust. Bonhoeffer was killed. And he's making that strong analogy of what's happening now. And there seems to be no counter argument about that other than just, we're listening to them, here's their motivations, here's what they're trying to do. What is the theme on the other side that can still capture Christianity, but not in negative terms?
Well, I don't necessarily agree that people on the progressive Christians, liberal Christians don't have facts. I mean, you just heard me give you a whole lot of them. I think we don't have always the good sound bites. I don't think, when you think complexly about things, which is the ways in which liberals and Democrats tend to shoot ourselves in the foot, it's harder to articulate something in a soundbite, and it's not as captivating. And so we do need to continue to find ways to make our arguments so that they reach people without having to overwhelm them with a flood of complexities. But we like complexity, and that's part of, tolerance for ambiguity is one of the good things about education. I was going to say something else to you about, Eric Metaxas. Eric Metaxas has written about Bonhoeffer in ways that most Luther scholars do not approve. He tries to set Bonhoeffer up as a kind of muscular hero, and of course he was a martyr, but Metaxas has become a very right-wing apologist, and at this point, most mainstream Lutherans would not say that he represents a Lutheran prophetic stance. The Confessing Church in Germany did stand up against the Nazis, and they had a lot of factual arguments. One thing to know about the use of facts and statistics and that sort of thing is people are often very indiscriminate about where they find these facts, right? And it's really important to have some internet literacy to understand, okay, what's the source behind that supposed fact? Or is it a reputable source? Same like, every journalist does fact-checking. One of the ways in which right-wing political operatives, whether they're Christian nationalists or right-wing politicians, what they will do, this kind of goes back to Glenn Beck and some others, Sean Hannity, they will inoculate themselves around the misinformation by saying, now those liberals are going to tell you X, Y, Z, and they're going to quote all of these studies and tell you that you're wrong, but they're lying. So then, now let me tell you what's really true, and then they tell them lies. So there's a way in which truth and lies get flipped in a very manipulative way, and they're told so convincingly. One thing that I learned a long time ago in working with battered women is that often an abuser can lie more convincingly than a victim can tell the truth. And these are people who excel at turning lies into, what was the term? Alternate truths? Alternative truths? Alternative facts, right. Alternative facts. So, check your sources. But I do think that it's nefarious, the ways in which we, those of us who are gospel-grounded Christians, can get painted with the same brush because we say we're Christians, and we need to be more visible in saying, no, there's another way to think about this. And your very last question about, what are we grounded in? We're grounded in the words of Jesus. We're grounded in the gospel. And the gospel does not say to hate people.
Maybe we should read the Beatitudes.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you what I think is, for me, a bottom line practical question. And I want your advice on a very personal level for someone like me who, I hate to use the term combat, I don't like combating anything, but influencing on our daily lives folks who subscribe to this philosophy. What's your advice on that level? And secondarily, but just as important, is what's your advice for this church, this congregation? What should this congregation, this church be doing to influence this in a more gospel-based, rooted way of being?
Thank you. I don't know if advice is something I can give you without knowing your particular situation or this congregation, but I think, you decided it was me who should come and talk to you, but you decided somebody should come who knows something about this and talk to you. And that's the opening, and hopefully this is a beginning of a longer conversation among you and not just the first and now we've done it, So I really believe in talking things through, finding out where each individual really sits with all of this, because I'm not assuming that everybody in this room is unanimously exactly thinking everything the same. And have table conversations. Use the resources from Christians Against Christian Nationalism. They really have great stuff. And keep working at dialogue. But I also think one-on-one individual conversation is not going to do it all. As important as I think it is, I also do believe in what I said earlier about run for office. You can run for office. You're smart people. Write op-eds. Counter some of the things that you hear other Christians or people who call themselves Christians saying and say, I read that piece by so-and-so in the local paper, and as a Christian, I disagree because. And then quote the gospel. There are things that each one of us can do in the public sphere, and some of you are more extroverted than others, but there's always something you can get involved with, or get involved with somebody else who's doing it and support their candidacy. So we do need to be more public as liberal and progressive Christians about the fact that not all Christians agree with Christian nationalism, because I don't think that message is as strong out there as it needs to be. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
I don't know if this came up in your research at all, but I was curious, thinking about the kind of profile of a Christian nationalist, how did that relate to intimate partner violence, if it did at all?
I don't know that anybody has actually researched that in terms of finding a correlation. From my experience in the battered women's movement, I can say that intimate partner violence happens across all social strata, across all different religious backgrounds. It's not unique to one particular group or another. But the notion of male headship that is embraced by pretty much all evangelicals, not just Christian nationalists, does set up a structure in a household where it's harder, I think, in a heterosexual marriage, it's harder for the woman to be able to have equal power and authority in the relationship. So there's another religious layer over the sort of general control that an abuser has. When things get cloaked in religious language, they always become more difficult to extricate yourself from. And of course, we know that intimate partner violence happens also in LGBTQ relationships, and it's ubiquitous, but there is a particular religious twist, I think, that gives it a certain power in those relationships. And it's not a surprise. This is something I did look into quite a bit. The Southern Baptist Convention was kind of a case study for me. It's not a surprise to me that the Southern Baptist Convention consistently has tried to cover up and deny sexual abuse and misconduct within the religious community of various SBC churches and the whole hierarchy, because it is a very patriarchal church. So what we need to do in churches, of course, is to say this is not the way that we are taught, and that God doesn't want you to be abused. God doesn't want you to suffer in that way. Yeah. Did that answer your question enough? Yeah.
I want to piggyback on Arturo's question. And he asked, what can the church do? Most of your responses have been, what can we as individuals do?
Yeah.
What can a congregation do to make a difference in the community?
Well, this is one of the things that you've done. I think you keep the questions alive as a congregation. You can preach on it. Not telling you have to. You can, this is a big gathering. It's hard for all of you to talk together, but to do adult forums where people can be in table conversation with each other and that sort of thing within the congregation, and to keep the information flowing. Don't let it be a one-off. And then I do believe that congregations can participate in public movements. I mean, I was affiliated with the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, which is where that picture came from, where you saw the peace vigil. Well, they did this was for Black Lives Matter. They hung banners on the front of the church. They had a peace vigil on the steps, and then we marched from there to Adam Clayton Powell Square. And it was a very different kind of march than some of the other marches that weren't affiliated with any sort of religious community. It was people who were in it were saying, this feels much more peaceful than a lot of the marches that they had been in. But we have a responsibility to be prophetic as Christians, and I think pastoral and prophetic they're not split. That's a false dichotomy. So the church may decide to send a contingent to a march, for example, if there's a march for peace at some point in this area, find out what's going on in the community and participate so that, I don't know what your outreach programs are, but outreach can include involvement. For example, in Gettysburg, we have a group called Gun Sense Gettysburg. The congregation may decide to send some people to be a part of whatever the local responsible gun ownership group is. You can be involved in things that are not simply soup kitchens, not that I think those are wonderful, but not just service, but also advocacy as a church. And then, there's always a process you have to go through as a congregation. This is a big congregation, to decide where are the places that we really want to put that kind of advocacy energy, but you can do it. I don't mean to put you on the spot. Yeah, I know. I'm just answering the question.
A gentleman over there mentioned his friend calling him a fascist. I'm wondering about the relationship between fascism, which is a term we hear quite a bit, and Christian nationalism. Is it the same? Is it different? How do they relate?
Well, fascism is authoritarianism, authoritarian rule, and I think there's a good deal of overlap, because I would say there are plenty of nationalists who are not necessarily Christian nationalists, but white nationalists. It is a fascist movement in the sense that they want to have one group of people have authority and dominance over all the other groups of people. That's kind of the definition of fascism, and an authoritarian government that will enforce it. And it's scary to me that Trump seems to be moving more and more in that direction in his rhetoric. I don't think all people who subscribe to Christian nationalism are fascists or think that they're fascists, but I also think that people can get swept up in a movement that continues to move further and further in that sort of authoritarian direction, because if you think you're fighting Satan, then you don't need democracy anymore. What you need is to have the right thinking to fight Satan. And then democracy is kind of this little thing that could get in the way. So it's a spectrum. So there's a fascist end of the spectrum. I also don't think everybody, white nationalism is always, nationalism just as a term is not the same thing as patriotism. Nationalism is, wherever it's found across the globe, is always an effort to define a nation by a particular ethnic group. Those are the true Hungarians, those are the true Russians, those are the true whatever. And in our case, the true Americans, in this movement are white Christians. There are actually some people of color who participate in the movement, but they are seeing this as basically, this is what Christianity says we're supposed to do. We're supposed to take over the world. And then the world will be okay. So that sort of dominating thinking is a form of authoritarianism. Patriotism is love of country. Nationalism is a desire to define a people by a particular ethnic group.
So just a couple of thoughts. One, I think we get confused between the difference between a privilege and a right. So some people will say voting is a privilege. Others will say voting is a right. If it's a privilege, it means you can take it away. If it's a right, you can't. And I think you can see that in a lot of rhetoric. The second thing has to do with my understanding of Christianity, which is that it's an optimistic religion. It is a religion based, at least in part, on hope. And most of the relationships we have with people are not political. There are neighbors. There are, how are your kids? And if we establish more supportive relationships with people, then I think we can have conversations about more difficult things. But when our conversation is mostly about difficult things, then it doesn't work. And I think we have a wonderful role model in Jesus, if we would remember that. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm just kind of echoing other questions that have come up. I just want to push you for more solutions. One of the things you mentioned was education as a way to combat this. And yet I've been listening, for example, locally to the podcast for South Lake and Grapevine. It seems like we're the epicenter of this movement wants to try and control education. How can we combat it when that's one of the central tenets of what they're trying to combat? And then I want to push back just a little bit. I know that you're limited to a very short period of time and painting with a broad brush, but are all the people that subscribe to this movement racist? Are all of them necessarily Republican? And you leave the listener with the impression that they're a homogeneous group.
Oh, no, they're not. An overwhelming percentage are evangelical Christians. More than 2/3 of the Republican Party are white. These are all statistics that you can find. But as I said, there are also leaders in this movement and people who get involved as followers, and that they are very different. And, I don't call individuals racists, and I don't call individuals Christian nationalists per se. I call people who subscribe to the beliefs that are represented by the Christian nationalist movement. And some people would agree with all of those statements on the survey. Some would agree with some of them. And at this point right now, according to PRI, only about 10% are the really hardcore agree with every single one of those statements. So there certainly is variation. And there's also people who, it seems, started out more hardcore and have gone over mainly to being sympathizers, but not the hardcore folks. And that trend may be happening. We're not sure. Christians Against Christian Nationalism are tracking all of those data, but and there's change over time. So sure, there's lots of variability within the movement, and I don't think it's helpful to call somebody a Christian nationalist per se, unless they claim it, but to think about ways in which they've been influenced by the thinking of that movement. In terms of education, you're right on. In general, people who have gone through higher education tend to be trained to be critical thinkers in ways that people have not had that experience are not so trained. And so I'm a big proponent of as much education as we can provide to people. Doesn't mean people who don't have that higher education aren't smart, but they may not have the tools that you get when you go through high school and college to ask penetrating questions about things, which is part of the skill that you get by going through education. And it troubles me a great deal that a lot of the infiltration that's happening at the school board level of local public schools is really, it's basically a movement to not allow kids to be exposed to the complexities of the history of the country and to say, we're a great country, and here's all the wonderful things about us, and here's all the patriotic ideals, which are beautiful. I don't contest that. I believe in Enlightenment values about, liberative messages about people's individual rights. But it doesn't stop there, and the attack on critical race theory, which many of them don't fully understand what it is, critical race theory is simply started out in the legal field, but it's simply saying there are issues that have been long-standing in this nation back to the founding that have to do with racial disparities and inequities, and we need to understand the history in order to make it right. And so that's where the white nationalism piece comes in, that there are many people who are very threatened by that notion because they really don't want to give up their position of privilege. So a lot of it functions at an unconscious level, I think, and a lot of it functions at a level of groupthink. So yeah, it's more complex than maybe you've heard me talk about it tonight, but it is complex. But that's also where the hope is in terms of being able to have dialogue with people, is that because things are complex, that sometimes gives us a point of connection where we can make our way back in and have a conversation about it.
I noticed among the figures of Jesus that you showed, there was not a crucifix. There was not a hanging Jesus on a cross, which is at the foundation of what the Christian message is all about. It is a scandal and it is promise. And I think that that bears some reflection upon, in the sense that the folk who are in the Christian nationalist movement are very hurting. They're very scared and very hurting people. We have capacities following the resurrected, crucified Jesus to be outreaching to those folk and to be loving to those folk and to outlove them, if you will. And I think that that doesn't take away from any of the public kind of demonstrations and office holding, but it's also something for each of us to remember if in fact we think that some of that other stuff is so overwhelming we can't do anything.
Thank you. Yeah. Also, the way, it really did astonish me when I started looking at televangelists and hearing people who are leaders talk, that there's a wonderful book by Kristen Kobes-Dumez called Jesus and John Wayne, and she traces the ways in which a movement for decades now has tried to show Jesus as a muscular sort of superhero. And that is not the Jesus of the Gospels. And what you just pointed out, we believe in a Jesus who was born in a manger in a cave and died in a horrible torture instrument. And so whatever Jesus' idea of leadership was, it wasn't about accruing power for himself or for his group. And so that's one of the distortions of Christian nationalism, is that it's led by people who want to keep power for themselves and make alliances with right-wing politicians and to rule the country. And Jesus was not about a dominating rulership. And so The other thing I wanted to say back about optimism, do we have an optimistic religion? I think we have a hopeful religion. And I get asked this a lot, are you optimistic about the future of the church or the future of the United States? I say, I'm not optimistic, I'm an analyst. Of course I'm not optimistic. But I'm hopeful. And hope for me is about being in it for the long haul and believing that God, the Spirit, is moving among us for the good of all, not the good of some. And that we can, through prayer and through action and through all the ways in which you've also suggested here tonight, we can align ourselves with God's will, God's desire, and be a part of that movement of love and justice that God calls us to do. I'm very hopeful about the human capacity to do that. But I think we're in a downturn of the waves that come and go around this stuff, and that we need to not only ride it out, but we need to try to what were we saying during COVID, to level it out? Yeah, to try to be more visible as witnesses to the gospel, as opposed to whatever these movements are that want to elevate individuals or one ethnic group over another. And maybe that's a place to stop tonight. Thank you.
I think that's a great place to stop. And I think it would be wise for us to remember that the first step in growth and progress is to be uncomfortable. And I think we've all been made a little bit more uncomfortable tonight.
Especially you. Sorry.
And so we are called, as people of faith, as followers of Jesus, to be evangelists. Euangelizo, a Greek word that means evangelical, means, behold, I bring good news. Our role as people of faith is to be hopeful, to be optimistic, and to bring good news. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
To be here tonight, for your courage in writing this book and bringing this message to all of us. This is an important time in the life of our country and in the life of the church, the Big C Church. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you all have a good night. Thank you so much for coming and for being a part of the ministry and the mission of University Christian Church. Grace and peace to you.